Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our final research conversation of the day. I'm very lucky and privileged to be moderating this last conversation. Again, my name is David Garcia. I am the policy director at the Terner Center. And so far today, we've had some really excellent, I think, conversations around different land use and housing supply policies. I've really enjoyed all of the panel so far, but I'm particularly interested in this one, not just because I'm moderating it, but because I think it deals with a really important component of everything we've been talking about today, and that is around the issue of enforcement and accountability. While California has passed a number of laws meant to spur the creation of more housing across the housing spectrum, those laws only really work if there is a measure of accountability and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that localities or other housing actors are actually using the law in the way that is intended, and they're following the rules that the state is putting in place. So with that in mind, we're going to cover some of that ground in this last research conversation. So today, I'm joined by a stellar panel of research experts. We have Moira O'Neill, who is a researcher at UC Berkeley, but also faculty at the University of Virginia. We have Michael Manville, who is a professor of urban planning at UCLA. And we also have Shazia Manji, who is a research associate at the Terner Center and lead author of our new report on Senate Bill 35. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in, but as a reminder, you all have cards at your table, so please feel free to start jotting down questions, and we'll save some time at the end to try and answer as many of them as we can. Mike, I'm going to start with you because you have done some research looking specifically at California's housing elements. And so for those of you who may not be familiar, the California Housing Element Law essentially is a set of rules and regulations that cities pass and say that they will adhere to in order to facilitate the housing construction in their city to the level that the state has mandated with regards to the state housing goals through the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And so, Mike, you and your colleagues have assessed how cities have been doing and adhering to housing element law. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and what you've found so far?
Sure. So this research that I did primarily with my colleagues, Pavel Monkanen and Michael Lenz, and a couple of students as well, we examined kind of the first batch of submitted and approved housing elements in Southern California. So the RHNA, the housing element process, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA process, happens at sort of staggered timetables across the state, and Southern California is where some of the first proposals to be submitted. And so they're the first sort of indication we can get of how well this process is going. And I think, Senator Wiener alluded to this. He wrote one of the big, as he said, reform bills about RHNA, SB 828. The issue, RHNA is a very old law, and it's never been a perfect law. But I think as time has gone by, and as for reasons we can talk about in the Q&A, for reasons, as time went by and as California changed, it became less and less effective. To the point where by the early 2000s, it was probably, not an exaggeration to say, it was wholly ineffective. And it was wholly ineffective because it sort of had this cascading system of errors in it, which in the first error was usually that the state came up with, and this is what Senator Wiener was referring to, a total count of housing that was too low. And then that total count would be distributed within regions in a very strategic way. And so what would happen, for instance, in Southern California is that the more powerful, high-demand, high-priced cities like Beverly Hills and West Hollywood would sort of lobby, and so that they would get assigned a very low capacity, whereas outlying regions, outlying cities like Coachella would get assigned a high capacity, even though there isn't much demand there. And then the third layer of strategic behavior that would occur would be that those rich cities with their low counts would then behave strategically in complying, right? And what they would basically do is, rather than rezone to sort of say like, oh, we've been assigned, we've been asked to sort of make room for 100 new housing units. So rather than rezone for those 100 new housing units, they would say, we've identified 8 sites in our city that we think are going to be redeveloped, and they'll be redeveloped. They could be redeveloped into 100 units of housing. And these, you could question whether it's sort of error or intent, but these sites usually strained credulity, right? Fully occupied shopping malls would be slated for redevelopment. In one case, the city's city hall was listed as a place that would be redeveloped. And so one of the big changes that so that's the background. And what happened was, as a result of this package of reforms that happened over a couple of years, all of these things changed. But the really big one that changed that we identified is just that the total count was bigger, right? So and to give you an example of this, in the last RHNA cycle, California was assigned, or the total RHNA count was about 1 million units. And in this most recent RHNA cycle, it was 2.5 million units. And I think what we found is that this worked, and it worked because once you have that bigger number, all the other strategic behavior is a lot harder, right? It's a lot easier to shove some of the housing away and lower your own count if you're a rich city, if the total number's lower, and it's a lot easier to sort of manufacture dubious sites for redevelopment if the number you have to hit is lower. And so we found that big initial number had a sort of self-enforcing property. And what we found when we looked is that places that had a bigger sort of ratio, a bigger jump in their assigned capacity, so that the ratio of what they were assigned in 2017 to 2021 was larger, they were actually more likely to rezone their land and less likely to resort to saying that, for instance, existing properties were going to be redeveloped. And so we took that as a sign that this was, in fact, working. Working doesn't mean it's perfect. Right? And I know Alex Fish is here, and he can tell you better than I can that there are plenty of cities in Southern California doing all sorts of things to explain why they can't make room for housing. But we do think the results are promising.
Great, thanks for that. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to Shazia and your specific research on Senate Bill 35, which we've talked a lot about today. We mentioned, but just as a refresher, Senate Bill 35 is a piece of legislation that essentially allows developers to bypass local approval processes for certain types of projects, either 100% affordable or mixed income. And your work looked at how that law has been used so far since its implementation in 2017. Can you talk a little bit about how you accomplished that work and what the findings were?
Yeah. So our research on SB 35 sought to sort of paint a picture of the first 5 years of implementation of the law, including looking at where it's been used and for what types of properties since 2017. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from the research that we did was finding out that SB 35 has really become the default preferred method of streamlining for affordable housing developers. And in that, I think the law has done in many ways what it was designed to do. And we heard quite strongly from affordable developers that it has successfully accelerated the housing approval process for their projects and has resulted in this sort of increased certainty that their projects are going to get through as long as they know that they can come in and see that they're going to tick off all of these boxes on a checklist. And beyond that, the city can't deny the project. And that they're going to get their projects approved in a relatively timely way. And that, in certain cases, has allowed developers to apply for their funding sooner for projects, which is another way in which this has sort of helped accelerate the overall timeline of housing development for affordable projects. Overall, we've found that over 18,000 units have either been approved for streamlining or are pending approval between 2018 and 2021, and about 13,000 of those are designated for lower income households. The law has primarily been used in Los Angeles and the Bay Area regions, though use of the law has increased over time in other parts of the state as other cities and developers have sort of become more familiar with how it works. And then lastly, what I'll say is that like with any other state law that gets passed, that local cities are required to implement, there has been a learning curve for both developers and planning departments in figuring out how the law works and how to apply it. We've heard that from planners that the guidelines that HCD has published to help them understand how the law works has been really helpful and is a great resource and perhaps a model for other state laws that have been passed as well. But there is a certain amount of greater clarity that local planners and also developers are seeking from some of the guidelines. And so some of this learning curve has been sort of getting up to speed on the more technical aspects of the law, so understanding all the different environmental sensitive areas where you cannot apply it, and understanding how to apply SB 35 in the context of complicated local codes and in combination with local incentive programs. And then lastly, I think it also has been an adjustment for local governments to have less discretion over individual projects. And so we've heard in cases in which planners are having to do this work to sort of educate local electeds and the public about this loss of discretion. And all in all, I think one of the broader takeaways is that affordable developers really want to see SB 35 extended and are really invested in seeing this type of streamlining continue and be more of the dominant way in which housing gets approved moving forward.
Thank you. And Moira, you've also looked at SB 35, specifically taking kind of a deep look at different locations throughout the state, including here in Los Angeles. So can you walk us through how SB 35 has played out specifically in LA and kind of put it in context with what you found in some other places?
Sure. So as a starting point, I have to give you the backdrop of the larger study that allowed me to do deeper research into how SB 35 played out in a handful of jurisdictions. So as a starting point, colleagues and I worked on gathering a lot of information on how 28 jurisdictions across California approved housing that would yield 5 or more units if it was built, looking primarily at entitlements because we discovered in that process that most of the jurisdictions didn't have a ministerial pathway to housing approval. Los Angeles, though, was unique in the cities that we studied. It was one of the handful of jurisdictions that did have a ministerial pathway. So did LA County. There were a couple others, but what was also unique and interesting in our first wave of research within Los Angeles is that it was one of the only 2 jurisdictions, it was LA and LA County, where we could find observations of housing approvals that were in fact approved through a ministerial pathway in the prior years. And so what we were able to do when we started to explore what happened with SB 35 was try to construct something of a comparison between different types of housing products, in terms of where they were located, the size of the building, as well as other criteria. In other words, we looked at our old data before SB 35 was passed to see how we could compare developments that would theoretically meet the criteria and qualifying criteria under SB 35 had it been applicable at that time. It's not perfect, but it allowed us some comparison so we could sort of see what happened in different places. So for example, in Los Angeles had a ministerial approval process, unlike many of the other jurisdictions, but it's limited, right? It has a size limitation, so we only had 3 100% affordable developments in our set of 1,000 developments, over 1,000 that we studied that were issued in those 4 years, and they were all smaller. They were all less than 49 units. But in the SB 35 context, we could study 18. And they were larger. And also we could compare them to the 100% affordable developments in the same neighborhoods that had similar criteria, similar characteristics, and look at the differences. And what we discovered is that the timelines in terms of planning review were pretty much cut in half. So for example, in the same neighborhood, 2 similarly sized buildings, you would see it would take about 7 months in Los Angeles for entitlement, and it took about 2.6 months under eligibility review with SB 35, so there was an impact there, certainly. The other elements, of course, in terms of impact is that they were not going to be subject to administrative appeal. That took a little tweaking, but that was important because in the prior years, we did see a high frequency of administrative appeals of approvals. So something might get approved in LA, but it had a pretty good chance of facing an administrative appeal comparatively, relative to other jurisdictions we studied. So that was significant. And then of course there's the relief from CEQA. Much of the affordable development we looked at in the prior years had to deal with the mitigated negative declaration and so on. So that process is now removed. What was also interesting is the difference. You asked about how does LA stack up against other cities. Well, a lot of the other jurisdictions that we studied, most of them did not have a ministerial pathway. So SB 35 was the first time a development could move through, a multifamily housing development could move through a ministerial pathway. So that was quite significant in some of those jurisdictions. Didn't always mean that it unrolled in, in a smooth manner. Some jurisdictions had a hard time, I think, interpreting SB 35 and applying it, just as sort of shared earlier. Oakland is a great example of that, right? It was a jurisdiction where some of the timelines in our ministerial review sometimes were a little bit longer, and it had a lot to do with the complexity of figuring it out. They actually moved faster under their own processes, but then a quite different narrative would emerge in Berkeley or San Francisco, which both have very complicated, completely discretionary review. And in those places, the timelines were cut considerably. It also simplified the entire intake process and the application process. So that was a lot of what we found in that paper.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I'm gonna just throw out some general questions there. Hopefully this will stir some conversation. But we hear a lot about, and even today, about more recalcitrant cities, like Huntington Beach, per se, that are very eager to flaunt state rules or to try to do so. So my impression is that when we're talking about accountability and enforcement, it's not always that obvious that you have cities that may be unintentionally complying because maybe they don't have the resources to do so. So I guess my question is really, how much of when we talk about enforcement accountability is it of cities actively trying to undermine these broader state housing goals, and how much of it is a learning curve and that some cities are just really under-resourced and they have to implement all of these laws and also do the actual planning work that they're kind of hired to do. So I'm going to start with Shazia there.
Yeah, in the context of SB 35, I think we've seen basically all of those examples that you raised. But I'll say first that affordable developers who are the primary users of SB 35 to date are not often using SB 35 in an adversarial way to push through housing approvals in the most resistant cities. I think what we heard is that the affordable developers have in some cases come up against a situation where a city has just flat out said, we will not support your project if you pursue SB 35. Or where they worry about their ability to obtain locally controlled funding for affordable housing for future projects. And so if developers have ongoing relationships with cities that precede and continue past any particular project. And so in a lot of situations, SB 35 is not the tool that they want to use to threaten that relationship with the city. And we have seen some of the more egregious examples like you mentioned. So for example, one that stands out to me is what happened with the first SB 35 project in the city of Burbank, where the city council essentially designated themselves the design review board for all SB 35 projects. And when they got their first application, they rejected the project, even though the staff report that they had gotten from their local planning department said that the project was consistent with SB 35 and could not be denied under state law. So eventually this was resolved. There was a lawsuit. HCD issued them a notice of violation, and they settled, and eventually they did approve a slightly modified version of the project. And since then they have seen and approved other SB 35 projects as well. But I think SB 35, to the extent that some of the early resistance to it has not been successful, cities have sort of come around a little bit more and are starting to see it as a little bit more of a carrot. And then on the other end, we have also seen, I think what you were mentioning in terms of capacity issues. We've heard from smaller cities with less staff capacity and even some more moderate-sized cities that it can be challenging to complete the review and approvals within the required timeline under SB 35. And some of these cities retain pre-application processes that they have through their more traditional entitlement processes, which I think there's some uncertainty there from developers and from planning agencies around whether or not they should be wrapping up those pre-application processes in the formal timeline within the shot clock that's required under SB 35. And there's I think what we also heard is that there's quite a bit of interpretation that jurisdictions have had to do to understand all the environmental restrictions that are built into SB 35, and they are seeking maybe a little bit more support from HCD in the front end in figuring out how to make sure that when they're reviewing a project that it doesn't fall into any of those places. And so there are certain things that I think the state could do a little bit more to provide that clarification and certainty and to make it as easy as possible for local governments that have low capacity or limited staff to make it easy for them to comply with the law.
We'll go down the line. I mean, yeah, I think with respect to RENA, I think most of the resistance is, in fact, strategic. Sometimes we say to the students, like it's actually easier to study than to cheat. And I think this conceptually, like it's not like, I don't want to minimize this because this is a state law and state laws involve a lot of paperwork. But if you get an allotment of zoning, of housing that you have to make room for, and you're a city, in principle, you can do that in one day with a stroke of a pen. You can just upzone your city. It becomes work once you decide you don't want to do that. Because then you have to find all these sites and say like, oh, okay, no, this, I think it's going to get sold and it's going to get redeveloped and someone's going to build a tower there. And so, in addition to doing this research, I was on West Hollywood's advisory commission when they did their housing element, and we got our assignment, and the advisory commission, which was, nobody paid any attention to it at all, said in our first meeting, well, this is actually pretty straightforward. Like, 40% of your city is single-family zoning. If you just upzone a portion of that, like, we hit our markers, and this is something we should do. And they were like, there's no way in hell we're going to do that. Right, and so there has been a cottage industry in California of consultants that cities can hire, right, with a wink and a nod, because what those consultants deliver is the ability for you to get certified without rezoning. And that's what West Hollywood did. They paid someone to evade the spirit of the law. And that's a lot of work, right? Because you have to point at these buildings and be like, yeah, this is going to get taken down and turned into like a 20-unit apartment building. It would have been easy, not politically, but like it's not like nobody knows how to upzone. And so I think that it's not like Huntington Beach, which is like making a big deal of it. But I think a lot of the work that has gone into complying with RENA, quote unquote, for the last 30 years has actually been work to not comply with it.
To sort of add to what's already been shared and not repeated, I think there's also a complex issue of what some cities believe is the right path forward in terms of who should have power and what that level of power should be over land use. And so, for example, you're mentioning Huntington Beach, and Huntington Beach has definitely sued under home rule arguments. And in the Senate Bill 35 context, one of the cities that we studied also sued under the home rule arguments. And granted, and I'm referring here to the city of Berkeley, and the city of Berkeley faced a complex issue in terms of a proposal to develop under Senate Bill 35 that did implicate potentially issues of land that had an indigenous, heritage and historical preservation issue, and that's a real important issue, one that I think everybody would agree needs to be attended to. But in their arguments challenging the application of SB 35, they decided to go much farther than that. They decided to argue that SB 35 violated home rule, right? They didn't stick to the issue of that particular project. They went bigger and bolder in the same way that Huntington Beach does, right? And I wouldn't compare them across the board at all in terms of their local level policy around housing, but it is interesting, right, that these cities that are very different also take similar positions in terms of what they think the state's role is in intruding on their local power to approve housing. And I do think that that's another issue that's at play. So, it's not always maybe that there's a disagreement about the policy outcome. There's also maybe a disagreement about the tool to achieve the policy outcome that's still at play, and we don't yet have a consensus across communities as to who should be in charge of what.
Yeah, the juxtaposition of Huntington Beach and Berkeley making the same basic arguments to get around housing law is, I think, worth noting. So this was also brought up earlier, and I think it was a policymaker conversation that California has passed over 100 different laws related to housing since 2016, and by a lot of metrics, we have not seen a commensurate increase in supply, at least not yet. And there's some concerns that with an uncertain, volatile market, we're going to actually backslide. So I guess my question for everyone here is, from an accountability standpoint or an enforcement standpoint, California is clearly doing a lot, passing a lot of laws. Is there anything that needs to be done on the enforcement side or tweaking of some of these laws that have already been passed to really get to the level of production that California needs to in order to actually adequately address the housing supply shortage? Mike, I'll start with you for that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think part of the issue here, we make this point in the paper, and it's certainly not an idea that's unique to us. That's just, we change all these rules around regulations and zoning, not because those are important in and of themselves, but because there's a particular outcome we want, which is we want to see more housing be built so that it's a little bit less expensive. But the giant driver of actually producing housing that we have no control over is demand, right? And so that poses a problem for a state that wants to kind of compel local governments to do something, because it's easy for the local government to sort of disguise its low effort as some manifestation of low demand. And it's very hard for the state to sort of look in and see like, oh no, actually, you guys have very high prices. You should be able to be building housing right now, right? And so, and I think that's where active enforcement really does come into play. And I think for a long time, California just turned a blind eye to this, right? And I think that under some of these new rules and the new Attorney General's initiative, that's not going to be the case. But I think we shouldn't pretend that's ever going to be easy. So I do think one thing that came out of our paper that I think is important is that if you just have that big number that looms over all these, particularly these cities that have high prices and high demand, it's just, it puts them in a little bit more of a box, and it gets harder for them to behave strategically. And I think so the thing, we just have to keep chipping away at it, but chipping away at it intelligently so that what you're doing is you're slowly taking away the myriad ways cities that don't want housing have to block it, right? Because the problem is that all of these tactics, they just represent an underlying political sentiment. There's some cities that just don't want more housing. And so if you take, and certainly there's some rules that are more useful for that than others, but if you take away their single family zoning, they'll blow out their lot sizes. If you take away their lot sizes, they're only going to schedule a hearing every 4 months, and so on and so forth. And you just want to slowly sort of limit that flexibility, because some cities will be dragged kicking and screaming.
So I think that part of what we need for enforcement is information. So one of the challenges we deal with, of course, and what's happened over time is that jurisdictions that don't want to comply with RHNA obligations and targets, they can look for loopholes in different state laws. And how do you close loopholes? You have to identify them. How do you identify them? You have to have good information. So I think what's been really impressive over the past several years is a lot of the new law has been really thoughtful about requiring jurisdictions to produce the information that policymakers need to know to determine whether or not these jurisdictions are in fact complying with existing law, and to also provide thoughtful reform that closes loopholes that might exist because of a charter city status or so on. I mean, there's been a lot of that over the past several years, and I think that's been very helpful. I also think that the fact that enforcement exists both through the Attorney General but also through an administrative function, through HCD and other units is pretty powerful, and I think the trajectory we're on is a good one. So I'm optimistic there, but I think we have to keep, and I think that's the role of the researcher to help contribute to that, right, is to bring to light issues that are occurring with existing implementation.
And then I think to the extent that Senate Bill 35 is meant to be a stick on jurisdictions that haven't met their housing production goals, we've seen some examples of where this has helped, where we've seen SB 35 being pursued by a developer as sort of the last approach attempt to push through a project in a place that's particularly resistant to it. So those examples definitely do exist, but I think to the extent that it's meant to be a stick on jurisdictions that haven't met their housing goals, that's nearly everywhere, right? So there are 500 plus jurisdictions that are subject to SB 35, but only about 50 or so have seen any applications using this law. And I think, we're seeing it work better as a carrot, and that cities are coming around and maybe seeing it more as a form of cover provided by the state, where they can say to homeowners or other community members who are unhappy with the new development to say, well, we can't say no to this because we have to comply with state law. But again, to the extent that it's meant to be working as a stick, it's really not driving approvals or production in the most anti-housing of places. And then I think when I think of SB 35 and the role it's meant to play in sort of the enforcement story, I imagine and hope that it will work best in combination with some of the stronger housing element reforms, and that once we have more adequate zoning for multifamily housing or housing that can promote or zoning that could promote housing that is affordable at different types, then SB 35 can sort of come in and streamline those new housing projects. So I think to the extent that it's a procedural reform and doesn't make changes to zoning, it's a little bit limited, but in combination with many of the other laws that are being passed in California, hopefully it sort of creates the sort of web of enforcement that we need.
So I want to follow up on that last piece a little bit more explicitly, right? Because there is an explicit connection between eligibility for Senate Bill 35 and progress towards meeting RHNA goals. With new RHNA targets being as high as they are, I think it's very likely that you'll see cities falling into the category where they would have to allow Senate Bill 35 at that 10% affordability range. Right now, a lot of cities are in the 50% metric, which can make it much harder to use from a financing perspective. But given the high RHNA numbers that cities have to now zone for, and the Senate Bill 35's current requirements, do we think Senate Bill 35 is going to become an even more highly utilized tool in this new high RHNA number environment? Pose that to anyone.
I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, and it might be, when you say is it going to be a highly used tool, it might be used to the extent that we actually see projects. It might be used to the extent we just see the specter of it, getting people into compliance. It's earlier we were talking, I think Nick was talking about in one of the earlier sessions, Massachusetts is anti-snob zoning law, which for a long time was just, the game theory behind it was that it was never actually going to be used to build affordable housing. It was just used to scare communities into allowing market rate housing. And if the specter of SB 35 gets more communities to just rezone some land, I mean, that's great too.
I mean, I would just offer that ideally, with the higher RHNA and with more enforcement, ideally communities are also required to look closely at their process constraints, undo some of them, and provide local processes that can accelerate approvals and potentially through ministerial pathways, upzone appropriately and so on, so that you don't find the need to continue to use SB 35, right? It's not the preferred tool, it's what happens if they don't meet the targets. But ideally, we're not in that situation forever.
No, the dream is just that it's easier to build a bunch of housing across more of the land area of more of these cities.
Right.
And I think that's the problem that arose with RHNA, is that the entire RHNA exercise for the cities that had the highest prices and the most need became a way to avoid that outcome. Right? And that was the flaw that some of these bills were trying to undo.
Moira, to that last point, I think one of the more interesting takeaways for me from Shazia, your work, is that you actually saw SB 35 used pretty sparingly in places that already had these ministerial processes in place because they simply didn't need to use it. And so to your point, to the extent that the housing element process is now pushing cities to do more of these things on their own, perhaps SB 35 doesn't need to be used that much. I have one more prepared question, and then I want to get to some of the ones from the audience. We have a bit of time left, so if you would have a question, please feel free to fill out a card and we'll bring it up here. But But California has again passed a lot of laws in the last 6-7 years, and a lot of different states are examining taking similar approaches to addressing their housing affordability and supply challenges. So, so what would you say to a policymaker in another state who is considering something that California has done? Maybe both, as an example to follow, or maybe things that you would advise not doing, right? So, for example, the state of Oregon is embarking on a new exercise to create their own RHNA process. There's been a couple proposals in different states to require states to plan for a small percentage increase of housing. Some of it inspired by what they've seen in California. So how would you advise folks in other places to either follow California's example or maybe chart their own different path?
So as a starting point, I think the concept of fair share planning and zoning is great. It's a good idea that it's great if other jurisdictions or other states want to go down that path. I think what we've learned over the years, and I think Mike elaborated quite a bit on everything that went wrong. So I think what we've learned is that developing that type of policy requires thoughtfulness about how you're going to implement and enforce it, enforcement being really key, and how you're going to really sort of collect the information you need to understand what jurisdictions are doing with those rules. You have to be thoughtful also around, I think, the thresholds. I think one of the things I like about California's law in this space is that it creates at least these baseline thresholds. You must zone at least this density, right? Which for me as a researcher is also helpful for defining how I would even benchmark a jurisdiction's performance in their zoning. But I think there has to be thoughtfulness about what you're going to require jurisdictions to do in terms of the amount of land they're going to zone. I think we didn't attend to that, right? And then I think there's to get to that, you have to have the information forcing component of it. You have to have transparency around zoning and planning and around procedure and how they're applying it. But I also think there's the element of understanding that zoning, density, and use controls are one dimension, but process is another important constraint on what can actually be developed. And then you do have to be thoughtful about access to opportunity and what land is even being made available, right? So I hope that other jurisdictions that are contemplating this can think about this in a holistic way, because I will say that we're at a point now where we've learned so much about how we need to be thoughtful about density and use controls, procedure, funding, and allocation of land for affordability and for production and opportunity. But it took us a long time to sort of figure those pieces out.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. And I think California should be studied carefully by any other state as just to understand how things went wrong. I mean, I'd be hard-pressed to say that anyone should borrow ideas from California. I mean, what a mess we've made. So I think it's instructive to look back at the history of RHNA, right, and see that most of the steps that were taken at the time they were taken probably seemed sensible, right? And they just involved an underestimation of how much the state would change, what it would mean when most of the cities no longer had vacant parcels, and what it would mean when people decided they actually just didn't want any more housing, because then you had a system that once people wanted to game it, could be gamed very easily. And I think that's, the reforms that we've made to it are good, but I wouldn't want anyone to imitate that, because that would mean they'd gotten to a point that we were at where we had to take those steps. So I think that we're a good case to learn what not to do.
And then I think, to the extent that California is sort of a place of experimentation and that we've passed so many, like I think we said over 100 new policies, many of these, I think, something that we learned from our sort of scan of what other states have done, and including California and other West Coast states, is that we've seen that so many of these laws are iterative. It's us taking multiple bites at the apple to close loopholes or strengthen a law, and I am hopeful that policymakers and researchers who are studying how the progress towards implementing these laws are sort of laying a little bit of a blueprint and a foundation for what other states can do to take fewer bites at the apple, to get further along, like earlier in the process, without needing to pass, like 100 new laws. And then I think, sort of echoing what Moira was saying in terms of enforcement, like enforcement is important. And as you know, with the case of SB 35, I think we've seen the importance of providing that upfront resources to localities to make sure that they're able to implement laws to the best of their ability. One thing I always think of from an interview that we had with a planner in Santa Barbara County is they talked about how the housing crisis, you know, that's the thing that they're over there trying to, you know, resolve, but also it affects their ability to have adequate staffing to implement new laws. So they're saying we can't pay people enough to afford to live here and work in this department, and so their capacities are constrained by that. So to the extent that the states or, you know, any state that's implementing a law that localities have to implement, that we can provide as much information and technical assistance as possible to make that a smooth process. I think that's really important. And then lastly, I just want to say that, you know, one of the reasons that we were able to do this sort of statewide study of SB 35 is that the state required localities to report their use of the law in their annual progress reports. And I think that data collection piece is also really important because we're passing so many things and it's hard to track, you know, what is the impact of this policy versus another. And so having that sort of data collection built in as much as possible, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another +1 for good APR data. So I'm going to try and get through as many audience questions as possible. But the first one has to do with the exact opposite of the topic of this panel. Instead of enforcement, what about incentives? So the audience member writes, you know, the state's approach has been to force local jurisdictions to permit housing they don't want. What could we do to flip to local incentives and make locals want the housing? And so I kind of add to that, like, do we think an incentive structure would really work? And do we have examples of that?
I thought earlier another panel pointed out the limitations of SB 10, for example. I mean, I think of that as something of an incentive structure, as relief from environmental review associated with, you know, light touch upzoning. And isn't it right that jurisdictions haven't taken advantage of it? So I don't know, you know, I don't know that in all contexts we can depend entirely on incentives. I would also say, I wonder too about how we think of sticks. So when, for example, I conduct interviews in the research I do and I talk to people who work in planning departments, for them, it sometimes can be helpful to have state intervention. They might be differently situated than the political elected, right? So, you know, what manifests as punitive is really depending on, you know, your vantage point in that respect. Just pointing that out.
Yeah, it's hard for me to think of an incentive program off the top of my head that would work very well, but.
So I'm going to go to the next question here, which I think is really for you, Mike. You know, given the challenges with credible site inventories, would a better system be a probability-adjusted expected unit model of zoned capacity? Which, of course, you know what that means. Similar to LA's approach to its housing element.
Yeah, sure. You know, you have just some terrible site inventories, and can you imagine a statistical model that would be better? Yeah, sure. It would also be better if you just rezoned, right? Like LA has a great statistical model. That's good. Could have rezoned.
So I will also use this as a plug to the Terner Center dashboard, which I think is maybe alluded to in this question, which we have completed for Los Angeles, which does allow us to plug in a bunch of different variables and inputs and base zoning and tell us like what is the expected outcome of that, and maybe using more of those analytical tools to get better inventories, because to your point, a lot of them can be quite suspect.
Yes. Yeah.
The last question I have here, we have about a minute, but there seems to be progress on entitlement reform, I think what we've talked about with SB 35. Is there similar progress on permitting? And what could we do on that side of the housing equation? So in this instance, I'm interpreting permitting to be like issuing of a building permit, and basically everything that happens after the entitlements have been issued.
I don't know. I will say that one thing that we heard from developers in our conversations about SB 35 is kind of, what this question is getting at is that the entitlement streamlining is one part of a much longer process. And how do we sort of bring more tools or think of the process as a whole, I guess, in thinking through how do we streamline also the building permits, how do we provide enough funding so that developers, like affordable developers in particular, they're getting through projects faster, but they're still limited by the funding opportunities that are available to them to bring on new units. So I think I'm not aware of progress on that necessarily, but I think that's something that we've heard from developers as a next step that they're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're very low on time, but I would just say that a lot of those delays I think are often unintentional, and they're a product of staffing shortages and things like that. I know that in Los Angeles, after you get a building permit, there's often very large delays in getting a certificate of occupancy. Mm-hmm. And that's just because you have to wait for different utilities to come by and this and that, and where they want to site a transformer. And it can actually throw a lot of uncertainty and put a lot of delay into getting a project opened. And I think that's just sheer disorganization. It's a lot of different agencies that have to talk to each other, and there must be something that can be done about it, but I don't know what.
I don't have more to offer on that one. I've heard similar complaints as Shazia.
Well, thank you all very much. We're slightly over time, so please join me in thanking our panel for this conversation.